First, we'll call a roll call. Members, Garfield Reed,
Here.
Eric Gabriel,
Here.
Ed Abrams,
Here.
Lee Davis,
Here.
and I am present. We will start with the only agenda items, Housatonic Waterworks, appraisal by Raftelis. Mark, go right ahead.
Okay, so if you'll just bear with me for a minute, I'm going to go ahead and promote our consultants from Raftelis. We have two here with us tonight, John Mastraccio and Toby Fetter. And I just wanted to say while I'm promoting these guys, a copy of this report will be placed on our website tomorrow. We'll place it right on the homepage, so it's easy to find. And we'll also drop a copy in the Housatonic Waterworks tab on the Selectboard page, where we store all the other Housatonic Waterworks related documents. So you can look for that tomorrow morning. Just trying to find Toby. There we go. Okay, John and Toby, welcome. You're both promoted as panelists. And I'm going to go ahead and allow you to share your screen. And you can take it from here.
Okay,
Welcome.
great. Thank you. I'm going to just grab, let's see here. All right, you should be seeing a cover page of a PowerPoint presentation. Great. Again, thank you for having us tonight. We appreciate that the opportunity to present our findings of the value of the Housatonic Waterworks company system. My name is John Mastraccio. I am the lead appraiser in this engagement, in this effort, and I'll go ahead and walk through the appraisal results with a pretty short presentation here, and then be available to answer any questions that you might have. All right, so the appraisal assignment that we were tasked with was to value the Housatonic Waterworks company as a complete business enterprise, and we have done so, and we've done so in terms of a definition of value, which is called fair market value, and I'll define that here in just a second. But we applied appraisal standards that any appraiser would need to follow, and those appraisal standards are promulgated by the Appraisal Foundation, which publishes a set of standards called the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP. And so we followed USPAP in completing the appraisal work that we did. So the appraisal was for the 100% control and ownership interest in the Housatonic Waterworks system. So it wasn't partial ownership, wasn't a minority interest. It was for the full, complete ownership of the system. And the value that I'll present to you tonight is as of a certain date, and that date is January 1st, 2023. So I mentioned the kind of the definition of value that we are basing our evaluation on, and that is fair market value. And here's the definition from Massachusetts case law, which is the highest price which a hypothetical willing buyer would pay for a hypothetical willing seller in an assumed free and open market. So that's the definition that we had to abide by. And there are a number of kind of inherent assumptions built into that definition. And one is that there's the typical tension between a normal buyer and seller. So the buyer is looking for to purchase a system for the lowest price. The seller is looking for receiving the highest price in an open free market for the system. and neither one of them has any compulsion to buy or sell. Secondly, the assumption is that the buyer is assumed to be a financial buyer and not a strategic buyer. And so what that means really is that we don't build in any specific synergies or strategic premiums that any individual buyer might place on the system. It's purely a non-synergistic value estimate that we come up with. And we also assume that both parties have perfect knowledge of the system. The buyer is independent from the seller, so there's no interrelationship between the buyer and the seller. And the transaction is an asset sale for cash and not a capital stock sale or any type of other transaction derivative that there might be. So those are some of the assumptions that we based our appraisal on. And I'm going to cut right to the chase and show you the resulting value that we've come up with. So our opinion of fair market value of the system is $2.3 million. And we came up with that opinion of value considering three very common standard approaches to value. And that's the income approach, the cost approach, and the market approach. And we considered all three. And we also considered what's called a discount for lack of marketability, which I'll talk about here in just a few minutes. So let me just first talk about each of these three methods and what those entail and what the results of those different methods are. So the income approach is the first method or approach I'll talk about. And under the income approach, what we're really trying to do is value the future income stream that the water system produces for an owner. And so when we do that, we use the benefit stream that we look at is cash flow or income. And we look at how that income might change over time. And the method that we specifically use is called the direct capitalization method, where we take the income stream and we assume or consider that income stream is going to continue into the future at a constant growth rate. And so we take that every year of future income and we convert it back to present value and add up all those future income streams. So in our analysis, we used this discount rate of 7.7%. We used a growth rate of 3.4%. And using these estimates, we derived an indication of value under this approach of $2.2 million. And so this is, as I mentioned, only one of the three approaches that we looked at in terms of valuing the system. Next, we look at what's called the market approach. And probably most of you are most familiar with the market approach. So it's very similar to when you buy or sell your house. Or a car or anything like that. There you're looking, like, let's take the house example. You're looking at other house sales that are similar to your house and getting an indication of what your house might be worth based on what other houses have sold in the recent past. So we do the same thing under the market approach, except in the water sector, there are far, far fewer water utility sales transactions that are available to rely upon. And in this case, we found a total of 7 transactions that we thought were reasonably close to the Housatonic water company system. One was in Massachusetts, one was in Connecticut, one was in New York, 2 were in Virginia, one was in West Virginia. We considered the differences in those transactions versus the Housatonic system. And then we looked at what we call typical price multiples. So for example, when you're looking at your house and either buying or selling a house, you might look at a multiple, which would be a price per square foot. And so let's say your house next door sold for $200 a square foot, and your house has a certain amount of square foot, you can kind of imply an equivalent value for your house doing that. We do the same thing for a water utility system, but our price multiples are a little different. So we look at price compared to revenue or sales. We look at price compared to the number of customer connections there are in the system. We look at price per the cost or the original cost of the assets, price, and then price per earnings. And there are two measures of earnings that we use. That's EBITDA and EBIT. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and then EBIT is earnings before interest and taxes. So based on the 7 transactions that we looked at and their purchase prices and their characteristics, we came up with a value under the market approach of about roughly $2.5 million. So that's the second approach we looked at. And then third, we evaluated the asset approach. And really the asset approach is looking at the assembly of all the different assets that make up the water system. So it's the pipes that are in the ground, the treatment facility, the storage tanks, other meters and other valves and other components that are in the system. We look at what those components cost, and we use either a replacement cost or what's called a reproduction cost. And then we adjust that replacement or reproduction cost for depreciation. And there are really 3 forms of depreciation we look at. We look at physical deterioration. So that's over time, the assets, because of wear and tear, they get old and then they'd have to be replaced. And that's what's called physical deterioration, one form of depreciation. We also look at functional obsolescence. So do the assets actually do the job that they're intended to do? And are there other new technologies or new assets that would do that differently or better? That's what's called functional obsolescence. And then third, we look at economic obsolescence. And I'll talk about economic obsolescence in just a moment here. But here, what we show on the screen is the reproduction cost new. If you're going to replace the system new, what that looks like and how much that would cost. And we estimated that at somewhere around $36 million. And then we considered the physical deterioration and functional obsolescence on this particular slide. And when you look at the reproduction cost less depreciation, we estimate an amount of about $10 million for that estimate. But we're not finished with the asset approach. And the last form of depreciation that we need to take into account is what's called economic obsolescence. And essentially what we're doing with economic obsolescence is testing whether the income or the earnings of the system or the company supports a value equal to that reproduction cost less depreciation estimate. So we came up with $10 million on the prior slide. What we wanted to do is look at if someone buys the system and they require a 7.7% rate of return, what kind of earnings would the system or the company have to earn in order to support a value of $10 million? And here we said, okay, well, if we do that, then the earnings must equal around $800,000 a year to support that $10 million value. And so when we look at the history of the water company and the earnings and how much income that the system makes, excluding any type of capital reinvestments, the system's earnings are somewhere in the range of $200,000. So therefore, we conclude that there is economic obsolescence, and we have to reflect that in the value under the asset approach. So here in this slide, this shows the asset approach considering all 3 forms of depreciation: physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, and economic obsolescence. And when we make those adjustments under the asset approach, we come up with a value indicator of about $3 million. So now we've looked at all three approaches to value, and we've got to reconcile the three different methods. And so here's how we did that. So we looked at each of the three methods. We looked at the information that was used to come up with the value indicator under each methods. We weighed the limitations of each of the methods, and we combined all three in a way to come up with a value of $2.5 million when we look at all three of the methods combined. So that's slightly different than our fair market value opinion of 2.3 million. So it's slightly higher. But we haven't addressed one last factor, and that's what's called consideration of marketability factors. And so what we did under that component of our work was we looked at the potential buyers of the system and who might be interested in possibly buying the system. If, let's say, the owners of the Housatonic water system puts a big for sale sign up on the side of the road, what kind of buyers would we receive, and how many buyers would there be? So based on our knowledge of the water sector and the region, we don't believe that there will be a ton of buyers for the system. There won't be a bidding war by any means. The number of potential buyers will likely be very finite. And so the interest in this system in the market is going to be pretty limited. And because of that, we included a very small discount for lack of marketability as kind of our last step of our value assessment. And so that's why that's how we got from 2.5 million down to 2.3 million as the fair market value estimate. So, so in conclusion, that estimate of fair market value of 2.3 million considers all three of those approaches that I went through, and it also considers the marketability of the system if it was to be put up for sale. So with that, that was kind of the gist of my short presentation here. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So we'll start with questions from the board. Just if you could take that down so I can actually see the board members, it would make it easier. Thank you. Questions from the board?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ed.
Thanks. 83 pages are very dense, and I only have 3 questions. So congratulations. And this is not something I know anything about. So really, these are just to clarify for me. The hypothetical buyer definition was a private company as a buyer, right? I mean, I know you considered municipalities, but does that change?
It really, it doesn't change much if you were to say, well, no, the hypothetical buyer is going to be a public entity. But what we did do is look at who are the active buyers and sellers of water systems in the region, in the water sector in general. And what we found was that most of the market activity is with private companies, and either investor-owned companies or just private water companies buying and selling systems. Here, there could be obviously the town could be a potential buyer, but if there's only one potential buyer that's a public buyer, and let's say there are 2 or 3 private potential buyers, the most predominant, the most typical buyer that you would use as part of the analysis would be the private sector buyer, and that's kind of how we got to that hypothetical buyer. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes. The growth estimates,
Yep.
Which I know was pretty low anyway, but did you consider people pulling the plug and drilling wells, which has been happening?
So in terms of growth, what we're using for the growth rate reflects the potential growth in income, and because this is a regulated utility. The Massachusetts DPU regulates the utility and allows for a rate of return on rate base. So there's an allowable return that the company can earn. That's not necessarily dependent upon
Number of users.
the number of customers. They'll get that return regardless of number of customers. So we looked at growth in terms of population growth and potential there, but that was more of a factor that we considered.
Then here's this one's the tough one for me. The asset value, and I may not be understanding it, but you accepted the $32 million needed upgrades figure. That there are earlier.
We received it. Yes, we understand that that's a need.
So is that what brought it down to 10? And if not, because I don't think that is, did that figure in at all?
So to some extent, it did bring it down to 10. So we look at age and condition of the system and what the needs are, and that impacted the depreciation factor that we added. So that gets us to 10, and then we do that final step in terms of whether the income supports a $10 million valuation, and we said no, it doesn't, and we had to adjust it further.
Okay, so but that, I guess it was the 10 that I had a question on.
Okay.
Right? Did you not say, well, it's worth this minus the 32 million that they're going to need to put into it? It sounds like that's not what you did, right?
No, that's not what we did. We looked at, so looking forward at the needs for capital investment, that was a consideration. However, for any capital investment that's made, that raises the base with which you can earn earnings on. Right. So if you pump $32 million of capital investment into the system, your earnings are going to go way up, because the regulators will allow you to earn off of that. So that kind of mutes the downward pressure on value because of that earnings potential.
And then when the 7 million you subtracted, when you figure the earnings potential, did you then come up with a $7 million number to subtract, or did you just say, well, 3 million is the maximum they can? In other words, had the number been 14 million, would you have still gotten to 3 million? Because you're coming up from 0 rather than down from.
Yes, I think we would land at the 3 million. So that's really where the income approach and the asset approach kind of intersect. And so you have to test that asset approach with the income potential of the company. And so let's say we came up with 20 million as the asset value, we'd still have to deduct an adjustment to get down to 3, because the earnings just don't support anything more than that amount at this point in time. So
okay, thank you. I took one public utilities regulation class 40 years ago. This is the first time I've gotten to use it, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions for the board? Go ahead, Lee. You're muted, Lee.
Thanks. I had crying cats in the background. Thank you. It's very, very informative. I guess this is more of a bigger picture question, since you are an appraiser, and when people are, if there's a willing seller and there's a buyer, people generally get their own appraiser, and they're hoping for an outcome, whether it's a high number or a low number. So I guess this is kind of a bigger question is, if hypothetically there was a seller that wanted to get their own appraiser and your appraisal was put up against another appraisal that was considerably different, how does that work? I mean, where do people go with that?
I guess, first of all, I hope that our appraisal product, I hope that you can't tell, or anyone that reads it wouldn't be able to tell whether I'm working for the buyer or the seller, because we are completely independent. It's our obligation to provide an independent opinion of value. But that doesn't mean that two appraisers aren't going to have differences of opinion in how different aspects are going to be addressed in the appraisal. So if you have two appraisers with two different values and it's a negotiated sale, then it just those two data points kind of come into that negotiation, and any other factors that come into play in terms of how you end up at a purchase price get considered. So that's one way it could happen. And then the maybe other ways that it could happen is if it's a public entity looking to take a private entity, and there's a difference in opinion in terms of what the value is, then that could go towards litigation, and then it's the court that decides. You know, the finder of fact is the determinant on what the actual value is. So that's another way it could play out for public entities.
So to clarify, this could be used legally as a document to back up.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And just one other question: is this good for 1 year? Is that correct? Appraisals, if it was going to be used for a sale, or is that kind of general?
Yeah, I think 1 year is probably a good time frame. You know, there's not a lot that tends to change over time, but you know, if there's additional work that's put into the system, that would change the value. If market conditions change, that would change the value. And those things generally, you know, they don't change week to week, and oftentimes not month to month either. So I think a year is a good time frame.
Okay, thank you.
Eric?
Yes, John, thank you for your thorough report and the overview there. I guess when doing the valuation, how much consideration was put on not only the infrastructure, but just the general issues that the system is on record for having, as far as you know, the HAA5 in the water, you know, just the series of issues that they have with infrastructure, and you know, complaints to the DEP, all that. I guess just wondering how that plays into this.
Yeah, so that does come into play in really, I would say it comes into play in two of the methods. So the income approach and the asset approach that is considered. And on the income approach, it comes into play in terms of the discount rate that we select, as well as the incomes, the cash flow income stream is after annual capital reinvestments. And so as there's more capital needs, it reduces the net cash flow after spending on those annual capital expenditures. So it comes into play there. And then on the asset approach, again, we discounted the treatment component of the system significantly because of those factors that you mentioned. So there's really very little value that we placed on the treatment system because of the manganese issue and other water quality issues. So I guess that's how we addressed it.
Okay, thank you.
Lee, go ahead.
One other question: did you have full and complete access to everything that you needed to do this appraisal, or was there anything that you weren't able to get to that you had to then make a guesstimate on?
I think we had everything that was available. We were out. We did a site walk with the owner. We received operating reports, financial reports. I think we got everything that we were hoping to get in terms of completing the assignment.
Thank you.
Anyone else? So we will turn it over now to the attendees. There are 79 attendees.
Sorry, I was
Awesome.
muted. I have a question.
Go ahead,
Garfield?
Garfield.
All right, sorry, I was muted. So the price, thank you for your presentation. So if you will, the price at 2.3 is as is, if you will.
Yes, sir.
And so someone coming would potentially have to spend quite a few dollars to make it whole, just for using, for lack of a better term.
Yeah,
Which would definitely cause everything to rise in cost.
sure, yeah, any capital improvements that would be necessary to address any regulatory issues or water quality issues or aging infrastructure issues, that would be on any new owner. So that, yeah, so the 2.3 million considers that a new owner will have to do some additional capital investments in the future.
Okay, and now did you note the amounts, if you will? I don't remember, wasn't it? What the amounts to fix the pipes, etc.
So there was we reviewed an AECOM report that we were provided with, and there was a capital needs estimate that we referenced in our report, and I think we even put the table in terms of what the future capital needs are anticipated to be in the system. So that is in the report. I just don't recall the specific figure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'm thinking that's the $32 million figure over 20 years.
Right.
Yeah. So there are 80 attendees. The questions, we'll start with Frank. Just need to give your name and address. Just unmute yourself, please.
I'm Frank Gunsberg, 26 Hemlock Hill in Great Barrington. Couple of things. First of all, the comment about if the appraisers can't agree in commercial real estate, which is what I'm very familiar with, normally you avoid a lawsuit by just having a third appraiser that would then be a final arbiter. He would review the two appraisals and give a final adjustment as to what it was. That's the way you do it generally to avoid a lawsuit. But the point I wanted to make is, when you buy property and there's deferred maintenance, in this case, is the equipment up to speed and the water quality needs to be dealt with, that is normally not a number that you would add to the price. That is a number that if it's 2.3 million, but you have to spend $1.5 million to correct a deferred maintenance issue, that is normally something that comes off the price. If the fair market value for a clean, well-run system is 2.3. So I'm out of my league here. I know that. I'm not suggesting that the 2.3 is what I said it was, but I just want to point that out.
Okay, thank you, Frank. GM Heller.
Hi. I've observed the.
If you would say your name and address, please, full name and address.
Oh, my name's Glenn Heller and I live in Monterey. And I'm not a Housatonic resident, obviously, but I've been.
So typically, I'm going to let you speak, but typically we reserve this time to residents, but go right ahead.
Well, I'm concerned that the proposed $30 million that they would have to spend to upgrade and repair the system, this is Massachusetts, this is inflation going on. What if that number ends up being double or triple? What does that do with all your figures? And granted, if you spend triple of that, you can raise your rates under the rules of the DPU. But on the other hand, if people can't afford rates that are 3 times higher, you're going to have people going to abandon the system or just move away. So the bottom line is, what if that $36 million investment amount is not sufficient? What if it actually is in fact $100 million? What does that do with all the calculations?
Thank you. Do you want to just briefly answer that?
Yeah, I would just say that issue, in terms of affordability of future capital needs is present regardless of a change in ownership, right? So the current owner, if they're facing that amount of capital investment, would also have to contend with those affordability issues. So I guess one kind of maybe a little bit unique thing about the water sector is the way water companies generate income and increase their income over time is through capital investment. So if they make a capital investment, they're able to earn a return on that. And so certainly, if the numbers were drastically different than what we were provided, we would want to take a look at that. But it's there wouldn't be a situation where that would turn the value negative or anything like that. Or so I guess that's the best way I can answer that question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Deborah Herman?
Deborah Herman, 373 North Plain. I want to know whether or not you considered the potential cost to Housatonic Water of consumer lawsuits or legal action in calculating the value of the company.
No,
The company is facing a demand letter that I'm a party to that letter, and potentially other legal action in the future.
So no, we assume that there was no litigation or pending litigation on the water company. I think that's one of the assumptions that we have in our report. So, so the answer is no, that is not taken into account.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Trevor Forbes, go right ahead.
Thank you, Trevor Forbes. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
305 North Plain Road. Thank you very much for taking my questions, observations. A couple of things to follow up on Deborah Herman's point. I would think that some account has to be taken of legal action in terms of the end value of this particular business. I've got a couple of questions, in fact, here. One is that going back to your income assumption that the more capital you throw into this, the more you can raise the prices. I mean, the price of water in Housatonic, I think, is already higher than the price of water in Great Barrington. So it would seem to me totally illogical that you would actually have much scope to actually get a return commensurate with the capital you have to put into it, which would undoubtedly reduce the value of this particular business further than I think you've taken account of. The second point that I would make is you're using an NPV basis of this. So you have time value that actually helps in terms of creating a higher value. But that does actually assume that, for example, things like putting in capital, you can do over a 20-year period. What happens if you actually have to stump up the 32 million to make this into a utility that can work properly, say within the next 5 years? That again will reduce the time value that you get from that, and as a result of that will reduce the overall value of the business. Am I correct in that?
You are correct. So yeah, so the timing on capital spend does have an impact on the present value, no question. So depending upon when the needs need to be expended, you would, so let's say with your example, the needs would have to be expended in the first 5 years. Well, you would have more capital investments dollars going out than income coming in, and then your income stream would grow, but it won't grow until, like, let's say year 6, for example.
And it may not, but it may not increase at all if you're already charging too much for the water. This is the point I'm making. So
right,
are
so
some assumptions there that may not actually pan out.
If so, if the Massachusetts DPU recognizes affordability issues with raising rates to be able to generate income to support the capital program plus a rate of return, then what would likely happen is that the owner and the regulator would negotiate an implementation timeline that would address those affordability concerns. So those are they're very unknown at this point in terms of what that might look like. So yeah, could it have an impact on value? It could. So we had to document our assumptions in terms of what our value is based upon, and so.
But again, you're assuming that this is a company that's providing a product that is suitable at this particular time, but it isn't, quite clearly, because they have carcinogens in the water and they have manganese in the water. So this is not a product that is actually fit for purpose. So there is an element of upfront cost that has to come into this to actually provide something where the consumers are going to be happy to pay whatever they're paying at the moment for it. So there's an element there that tends to suggest to me that your valuation you've put on this is assuming everything else is fine, but it isn't. So this seems to me to be very much an optimistic valuation in that sense, that could actually end up being a lot less than you've actually indicated at 2.3 million.
Can I ask a piggyback on that? Because I think I know the answer, and if I do, then I understand this, which is, it doesn't affect the purchase price, because if say another purchaser were to buy it, a for-profit purchaser, they'll get the increased return for the investment that they put in. So it doesn't affect the price. If somebody like us buys it, who we are concerned that people can afford their water, if the town buys it, that's a better thing for the ratepayers and the people who have to drink the water, but it doesn't affect the fair market value. And if it did get to court, right, if we offer something lower and it does go to court, they're going to point to what a for-profit buyer would ask. I don't know if that was clear.
Yeah, Mr. Ayers, I think that generally is right, and that's kind of how our view is as well. Although the public speaker that just mentioned the limitations on rate adjustments, that's a factor that impacts both private companies and municipalities. Any rate case that shows significant rate increases is scrutinized on the private sector side quite a bit, and then it's really a negotiation in terms of how quickly and what projects can you prioritize to make the water quality better without impacting the ratepayers. And sometimes that involves state funds, SRF loans, or subsidized loans that reduce the cost of capital, which could be considered, but that's really beyond the consideration of the valuation at the point in time that we value the system. So
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
Phil Orenstein? Did we lose Phil?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
All right, you had me muted. All right. Phil Orenstein, 4 Alfred Road. Based on the brief presentation tonight, I think it just highlights that all these methodologies deal with all the uncertainties about the actual cost of bringing the system back to an acceptable level of water quality. And I think some of the other questions have mentioned that. Just looking at the income approach, I focusing in on that free cash flow number of 95,000 per year, which is obviously critical to the result in that methodology. Perhaps all the detail is in the presentation, which the public hasn't seen yet. but can you speak to, generally speaking, how you get to that number? Because I've seen the publicly available income statement of the water company. And so I have some guesstimates as to how you got there, but at the end of the day, you're probably removing the executive compensation and adding some assumption relating to the additional amount of annual maintenance required as a part of the improvement plan. My knee-jerk reaction is you may have lowballed that number in terms of what the additional annual maintenance would be. But can you provide a little more detail on that?
Yeah, so that's cash flow as well. It doesn't reflect any non-cash expenses like depreciation or other amortizations that may exist. So it's operating cash flow, and it does factor in an annual maintenance amount, and that there was a maintenance repair amount that the figure escapes me, but it's somewhere in the range of around 1% of the replacement cost of the assets. The other thing that we looked at, and which is very typical, is when you look at annual depreciation and what level of recurring maintenance, and I'll call it capital maintenance, that is appropriate, we look to industry guidelines for that. And so our capital reinvestment for maintenance has been, or in the appraisal, is somewhere around 1.6 times depreciation. And that's, I don't think that's lowballed. I think that's very consistent with other smaller systems that are dealing with aging infrastructure issues and regulatory issues. So that's how we get to the net cash flow figure. And yes, the details are in the report that will be available.
And I'm sorry, one last question. Is that before or after I presume an increased debt service cost to pay for some capital improvements?
It's pre-debt.
It's
a
before the debt.
Free cash flow.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Phil. Eileen Mooney.
I think this was just answered, but did you take into account outstanding loans?
So the value that we've come up with is a asset transaction value. So any loans that the owner has would not transfer to the new buyer. So the asset compensation would be our value estimate, and that would provide all the assets for the system without the debt, without the specific liabilities of the company.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm confused. This is not my field. So that existing loans would not have been deducted when you gave the amount, the estimated value.
So that's correct. This is a value of the
Okay.
the assets of the system. That's correct.
Thanks.
Okay, there's no one else. So I'll give one more chance to the select board members. Ed, you're muted. Any select board member? Lee, go ahead.
So just one last question. So if there was a plan, let's say a capital plan to say, let's say they were doing filtrations, or they were, had a strategy on replacing pipes, and it was a phased approach. Is that something that, as an appraiser, you could factor in and recalculate the appraisal based on, a kind of a strategy of phasing in a capital infrastructure plan? Or, if we knew that they were going to be replacing, a certain amount of pipes and doing a, filtration system, and how would that factor in, or could that be used in an appraisal?
So, yeah, so it could be. So there's an income approach called a discounted cash flow approach. We used kind of a single period, a single year model for the income approach. But if we had multi-years of annually, this is the amount of capital spend that will be made into the system, and we could make some estimates in terms of, okay, well, what would the revenues change to support those capital investments? We could calculate a year by year net cash flow amount, and then use that income stream to recalculate the income approach. So that's sometimes done when you have really good information and a plan going forward in terms of what it's going to look like. Here we didn't really have that. We had some guidelines on over the next 20 years, this is the amount that we think the system is going to need, but we didn't really know exactly how that was going to play out. So we didn't use that method, but you could use that under this approach. And then the other thing you can do is, like, if the town was a potential buyer, you can look at your own, what does that look like under, if the town owned the system, how would that impact what rates would need to be in order to pay for that? How would the expenses change? How would the revenues change? And you could run a model as a town system and get a real good sense in terms of what customers would have to pay if that situation played out. So I hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no more from the select board, we'll start citizen speak time, which could be about any topic except the airport, of course. Anyone have anything else to say?
Steve, if you don't mind, while we're waiting for hands to
Yes.
come up,
Sure.
a number of people joined the meeting later. So I just wanted to mention, in case anyone missed it earlier, that we will have this report posted tomorrow on the homepage of our website. We'll also have it posted on the Housatonic Waterworks tab, which is located on the select board page of our website. So we'll have it in multiple locations.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, seeing no other hands up, any media time? And seeing no hands up, any other select board announcements?
Just we're up to 82 attendees right now.
From 81.
Oh, down to 81 now. And there's some hands, sorry.
Okay, let me see. Go ahead. Charlie Williamson, go right ahead.
Can you hear me, Steve?
We can.
Charles Williamson, 48 Blue Hill Road. I just have one question, and we might not have an answer, but when does the Board of Health get involved with unsatisfactory water being sold in Housatonic? Why isn't the town, the Board of Health, assigning once in a while a fine to motivate Housatonic Water Company to do something? If they were fined, I don't know, just say $500 for a month, for 1 month, it might make them think, well, maybe next year it's going to be worse, because I know what you people are doing, it's great, but in the 3 years you've been talking about this, the water hasn't gotten any better. And this year, June, July, and August, and September, you're going to have dirty water in Housatonic this year, next year, and the following year. I don't see any solution to this, and getting fines motivate people. That's my only question.
Yeah, and you're correct. We don't have the answer to that, but that would be a question for the Board of Health. It's a good question.
Well,
Can I address?
Yeah,
I
go
also,
Mark
can
says,
can I say some more?
yeah, of course, go right ahead.
We know that they're finding carcinogenics in the in the water, and I'm wondering if the Board of Health has even run a statistical. Is the death rate in Housatonic from cancer higher than the national average? I think there's some really questions out there about health and young children. I always gets me is we know that there's 3 and 4 year olds and even younger drinking that water. What's the long-term effect? I'm just wondering that the Board of Health should get more involved with this. I think it should, if you motivate somebody with a fine, when you get a speeding ticket, you do slow down. That's it. Charles Williamson, thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a short answer to that question. And the
Right.
short answer is that the Board of Health does not have jurisdiction over public water supplies in Massachusetts, only private water supplies. And this is considered a public water supply and it's regulated by DEP.
Thank you, Mark, for that clarification. Frank, go right ahead.
Yes, just two things. One on the water.
Name and
one-
address, please.
Oh, Frank Gunsberg, 26 Hemlock Hill in Great Barrington.
Thank you, Frank.
Two things. Number one, based on that last comment, I'm having a little trouble understanding why the state of Massachusetts doesn't come in and just take this over and get it right. I can't believe the years that have gone by already and that are coming forward where, yeah, it's in our town, but just like you said, it's a state regulated water system and it's polluted. So I'll just mention that. And the other thing I wanted to say, and Steve, you know this because I've told this to you and to Mark, I wish we had a system where it wasn't hut and peck to find out when meetings are. If it's in the Eagle and it's in the Berkshire Edge, or it's somehow where we have an email address or something that people can look at a monthly calendar to see what things are, it makes it easy. I didn't know about this meeting until I read about it this morning in the Edge, and the article didn't say anything about how to get on the Zoom. And I contacted you and Mark, and you guys let me know, and I found it. But I shouldn't have to do that. So I recommended a monthly calendar be posted, maybe in the shopper's guide or whatever. And I was told that that's not going to happen, which is okay. I'm just trying to come up with ideas where we all can know what's going on without, oh, I'm sorry, I missed that meeting.
You can sign up on the town's website for agendas to be sent to you, so you know when meetings are of different boards.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, you can.
We also did send out a reverse 911 call, and anyone that's registered on our code red system would have received the call, a text message, an email, however you subscribe. So we did our best to retrieve
Okay. I'm 77 years old, so I'll have to have my 8-year-old grandson tell me how to do that.
Frank, just reach out to my office. We'll help you get registered.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
and that applies to anyone. Anyone who wants to get on and doesn't know how, just call the town manager's office, please. Okay, Elizabeth Rockefeller. Just unmute yourself, Liz, please.
Elizabeth Rockefeller, 284 Park Street, North Great Barrington. Regarding that last question about our statement about the state, why doesn't the town contact the federal DEP and look to them for some help and guidance and bypass the state? Because the state has not done anything yet to help us either. So that's my question.
Mark, do you want to delve into that?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that the EPA has any regulatory oversight over our Massachusetts water system, but we can certainly ask that question.
Charlie, you have something else you'd like to add? Go right ahead.
Yes, Charles Williamson, 48 Blue Hill Road. In your remark there, Mark, about state DPW, I apply that then to them and not the Board of Health. It really seems like the state is doing nothing. They're turning a blind eye. If they find them, then they would be motivated. But in response with Liz Rockefeller, what she's stating is the federal EPA, if you request them to come in and do a study on Housatonic water system, they will come in and do it. because the capital of Louisiana, Jackson, their water system was so messed up, the federal EPA, and it's under the Clean Water Act, you are to be provided with clean water. You're balancing on the fine edge of one of these days, Housatonic could be all sick with water that's polluted. But the EPA will come in and do a study, and then it's up to the owners to upgrade if the EPA finds problems. And it's the law. The federal government will come in.
Thank
And
you, Charlie.
I think
go ahead.
I think the upgrade in Mississippi was over $800 million, but you can look it up. It's on YouTube. You can take a look at Jackson, Louisiana, and see that you can get help from the federal government. It's time somebody did something before you have a national disaster down there in Housatonic. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Any other select board comments before we adjourn? I see none. By unanimous consent, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.